One of the biggest questions that I have been wrestling with is how do we keep ourselves open to hope and the vision of a bright tomorrow? And at the same time that we acknowledge the suffering in our world and work towards alleviating it. Our Jewish tradition finds ways to acknowledge the light and the dark in our world so that on one hand, we don't turn away from pain, and on the other hand, we continue to be inspired by a vision of Bayom Hahu Yiyeh Adonai Echad Ushmo Echad, the vision of a day when the divine presence will be unified in all of us and we will perceive that unity in the most concrete of ways. This period of the Omer, between the holidays of Passover and Shavuot that we find ourselves in, is a beautiful example of how we anticipate the good and at the same time be real about what is dark and difficult. This week's Torah portion, Parshat Emor, describes the period of anticipation leading up to the holiday of Shavuot, when the Israelites are instructed to count 49 full days after Passover until the 50th day, the wheat harvest, when they brought a new offering of grain to God. In previous weeks, we've spoken about how our rabbinic sages have taken this counting from an agricultural process to a process of personal and spiritual growth, where our anticipation involves a commitment to self-reflection that will culminate in the revelation of Torah or deeper insight on the holiday of Shavuot. And over time, these days of anticipation became mingled with sadness and even mourning. Beginning in the 6th century, during the Omer period, marriages were discouraged, then haircutting, and eventually the use of musical instruments. Tradition associates the sadness of the Omer with the death of the students of the Talmudic sage Rabbi Akiva. As recounted in the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, all who died at the same time due to a plague. And the central teaching of why they died, they did not show respect for one another. They lived, breathed, and taught Torah, and yet they did not practice, they did not live the central ideas of every human being created in God's image and love your neighbor as yourself. We live in a world where people don't see the divine image in each and every human being. In this past year, anti-Semitic incidents continue to be the 3rd highest year on record since the ADL started working with law enforcement to track them in 1979. While we were fortunate to not have mass casualties due to anti-Semitism in 2020, especially after the horrific shootings of the past few years, there were 331 incidents recorded this past year that were connected to groups with extremist white supremacist ideology. And we see also anti-Semitism being expressed in more subtle ways in the political world, in which mistreatment, both in word and deed, of light-skinned Jews are ignored and minimized. Last month, the California State Board of Education approved the 4th draft of the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum for use in K through 12 classrooms. And as you may know, the first draft of this curriculum contained blatantly anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist material and was widely rejected by the Jewish community, including by the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, whose members took the lead in exposing the anti-Jewish bias of the draft, as well as Governor Newsom, who vowed that the first draft would never see the light of day. And yet a bill mandating ethnic studies courses as a graduation requirement in all public and charter schools, high schools in California, has been making its way through state legislature. And although this bill recommends that the school districts adopt the final approved ethnic studies curriculum as the basis for required courses, the bill also allows for the use of any curriculum approved by an individual school district, even the highly politicized anti-Semitic first draft that outraged the entire Jewish community. And I'm going to put more link to I'm going to put a link to more information about this bill in the chat. For me, the grief dimension of this Omer period is not only about the abstract reflection of how we don't respect each other and reckoning with the real danger to the Jewish people in covert and overt ways. It's also about not letting media manipulation and political jockeying get in the way of acknowledging the other groups of people in our world that are real recipients of disrespect and violence due to their ethnicity or color of their skin. Since the death of George Floyd, our news outlets have been flooded with the realities of racial injustice in both sympathetic and non-sympathetic ways. Since COVID-19 began, there's been a surge in anti-Asian hate and violence that have created real fear in communities where prejudice was always present. Now, as Jews who may be living in relative positions of comfort and success, it can be easy to let these realities wash over us and not engage for many different reasons. But we can't afford not to. The sources of hate and bigotry that other groups of people experience is made out of the same material as anti-Semitism. Today was Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer. Lag BaOmer is celebrated in Israel with bonfires and celebration. Last night was one of the biggest civilian tragedies Israel has ever experienced, where 40 died and over 100 were injured from an unintentional stampede on Mount Meron, where the festival was being celebrated. It's heartbreaking that this happened on any day, but especially since Lag BaOmer is the day when the plague on Rabbi Akiva's students stopped and his teaching with 5 brilliant students, all who truly lived the respect for others that the Torah teaches. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the 5 students who also died on a different Lag BaOmer, said about himself and his companions that we exist because of the love between us. So this is a holiday of hope, of commitment to creating a world that includes a respect for every human being created in the divine image. This past week, David Harris of the American Jewish Committee brought my attention to the fact that April 24th was the annual commemoration date of the Armenian genocide. It marked the systematic annihilation of approximately 1.5 million Armenians at the hands of the Ottoman Turks in 1915. What was the same this year as in the past was Turkey's denial of the facts and any historical responsibility for the tragedy. But what was different this year was the American position. Previously, Washington had jumped through linguistic hoops to avoid the word genocide because of political relations with Turkey, while still paying homage to the victims. But it didn't exactly work. Something fundamental was missing, and that something was honesty, which was in the end sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. And for the first time ever on this issue, President Biden referred to the murder of over 1 million Armenians as genocide. As Jews and victims of genocide ourselves, how could we possibly ignore or minimize the mass targeting of another people based on their nationality or faith? Victims of genocide must stand up for one another, educate each generation about humans' capacity for inhumanity and bestiality, and serve as monitors and early warning systems for other possible crimes against humanity. If Turkey is allowed to whitewash history, then just imagine the Pandora's box that will have been opened. Could that one day potentially target the Holocaust? To some, it may seem impossible, given all the recorded testimonies, museums, memorials, and monuments. But Holocaust deniers, both countries and individuals, are out there, have the tools of communications technology available to them, and await the day when there are no longer any living eyewitnesses or survivors, just as there are no more living eyewitnesses or survivors of the Armenian genocide. Some of us are familiar with the 1946 post-war confessional prose by the German Lutheran Pastor Martin Niemöller. He writes, "First they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, And I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Last week, our Senate passed a bipartisan bill to better address hate crimes, not only for Asian Americans, but for other groups as well. Our Orange County Board of Supervisors passed 2 resolutions against hate crimes and is partnering with Orange County Human Relations to create county-wide programming to raise awareness of prejudice and bias. After much letter writing and action taken by the Jewish community, the anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic California Ethnic Studies curriculum did not get approved. As much as there's darkness in our world, there is also light being shined everywhere. Just like Rabbi Akiva and his students were successful in building a respectful and loving community of Torah scholars from the ground up, we will also be successful in helping move the world towards a more loving reality. But we need to be active in combating anti-Semitism and expressions of hate wherever we find it. Shabbat Shalom.